Hello, ako si G. Geronimo at welcome sa The Green Report, Rappler's podcast on the environment and the stories of people whose decisions impact the world around us. Kasama ko ulit today si Iya. Hello, Iya. Alam ko naman na
Hi!
gustong-gusto mong bumabalik dito.
Siyempre,
Na at this
for the
point,
environment.
oo, at this point talagang mainstay co-host na dito si Iya, 'di ba? We are just actually kaya kami magkasama today is because we are just weeks away from this year's COP27 or the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference. And Iya and I are now preparing to cover the conference remotely. So, Iya, ano ba for our listeners, ano ba ang COP27? What's at stake? Ano yung mangyayari in the coming weeks?
So, syempre, yun nga, bago natin pag-usapan, mag-delve deep into COP27. Una-una, ano nga ba kasi yung COP27? Bakit ito importante? Why is it attended by heads of states, by ministers, and even attracts hundreds of environmental advocates to the COP? So, this conference of parties is a coming together of almost 200 nations in Egypt, no, to tackle climate action. So, isa sa mga goals ng conference na to ay gawan ng paraan kung paano bawasan yung greenhouse gas emissions natin na hindi umabot or at least hanggang 1.5 degrees Celsius lang ng global temperature. So, for the Philippines, this is COP27 is important bilang isa tayo sa mga pinaka vulnerable sa climate change impacts. Actually, this weekend nga, no, meron tayong inaabangan na malakas na bagyo, paparating na bagyo. So, isa sa mga importanteng usapin sa COP27 is yung pagbibigay ng tulong ng developed countries sa developing countries like the Philippines so we can weather through disasters.
Oh, tama yung sinabi mo na meron ngang paparating na bagyo and at this point, it has been, kumbaga, nasanay na tayo na merong paparating, pero dapat hindi tayo masanay at dapat we demand what developing countries like the Philippines should get from developed countries. So to talk more about COP27 and what we're expecting out of this year's climate talks, we invited Ivan Enrile, the Climate Justice Program Manager of Development Organization, Ibon International. Kumusta, Ivan?
Salamat, G and Iya. Okay naman ako. So we're preparing to go to Egypt in a few weeks, in a few days, no, for COP27.
How many are you in the team who will be going to Egypt?
Okay, so for our organization, it will be about 3 of us. Yung policy officer namin, si Jax, will be joining me in Sharm el-Sheikh. And then we also have our colleague in Ibon, Europe, joining us physically also at COP27.
Alright, sige. Before we go into the nitty-gritty ng COP27, balikan muna natin kung ano yung ano yung mga nangyari ng COP26. Ano yung mga takeaway natin from COP26 that we're bringing into COP27. Actually, Iya and I also covered COP26 last year, although again remotely also. So, ano yung mga wins and losses siguro ng mga nations, but siguro mas specific pa to the Philippines, like what were our takeaways during the last COP?
Specific to the Philippines, well, I don't know if I'm actually capable to deliver that analysis because even international, we're an international NGO. So ang focus talaga ng organization namin ay Global South countries, including the Philippines, of course. But beyond the Philippines, we also have our climate justice partners in different areas of the world, primarily those in the Global South. Pero I think yung interest din naman ng Philippines at ng ilang mga Global South countries converge. Kasi pare-pareho naman yung mga bansa na yan na nasa Global South na increasingly nararamdaman natin yung intensity ng impacts ng climate change, yung mga tinatawag nating climate extremes. So, siguro when I speak about yung priorities ng developing countries sa COP, yun din naman yung priorities din ng Philippines. So siguro meron tayo pwedeng gawing ganong generalization. But speaking of what came out of COP26, there were a number of commitments made, no, by developed countries to address, no, the current climate crisis. So number one sa kanilang mga kinomit ay sa usapin ng finance. They promised to at least double yung finance na napupunta para sa adaptation action ng mga developing countries. Because for the longest time, the trend has been that mitigation action has been getting the bigger chunk of the climate finance flows, to the detriment nga noong adaptation action. Bakit importante ang adaptation action para sa mga developing countries like the Philippines? Well, una sa lahat kasi tayo ay, yun nga, nasa frontline tayo ng climate crisis. We need to adapt to the changing climate. We need to adapt to the warming global temperature. Tapos, the impacts are costing us economically and socially also. No? May social cost and economic cost yung climate change. So we need priority para sa mga developing countries like the Philippines, yung adaptation. But over the years, no, ang trend mitigation yung nakakakuha ng mas maraming pera na dapat binibigay ng mga mayayamang bansa sa mga may hirap na bansa tulad ng Pilipinas. Bakit? Kasi yung mitigation siya yung mas nakakakuha ng greater profit returns. Yan. Yung mga infrastructure, yung mga renewable energy systems, yan, mga big ticket projects na mayroong malaking kapalit. Yan. Pero para sa atin na sa mga developing countries like the Philippines, importante sa atin yung adaptation. And unfortunately, adaptation is not as lucrative, no, as mitigation projects. So that one, they promised to double the adaptation finance. Second was that they also promised to talk about how to bridge yung mitigation gap because the current nationally determined contributions na merong at the table is not enough actually to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Actually, with the current NDCs that we have right now, it will lead us to, I think, 2.4 or 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And IPCC, or the International Panel on Climate Change, yeah, what they are saying is that we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So 2.5 is already way beyond, what they are recommending. Actually, even 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming is already going to have some irreversible negative impact sa ating ecological systems, sa ekonomiya, even yung social fabric mismo ng mga bansa. So yun, so they talk about bridging that gap between what countries are planning for that gap between what countries are committing to do in terms of climate action and what the world needs to do to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's going to be a conversation around that. But what we have been seeing, at least yung rhetoric na lumalabas doon sa mga negotiations, is that developed countries are increasingly trying to erase or to dilute the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities principle. Na ang sinasabi na ang buod ng prinsipyo na yan, yung mga nag-emit ng greenhouse gases sa atmosphere for the longest time, yung nag-profit sa paggamit, sa explore ng mga fossil fuels, yung pinayaman nila yung ekonomiya nila sa pagsusunog ng coal, sila dapat yung magte-take ng primary action para bigyan ng solusyon yung climate crisis at reduce and totally phase out nga yung paggamit ng fossil fuels. But yung rhetoric na dumalabas ngayon, parang mayroong pagpapasa ng responsibilidad. Parang
Mhm.
ang ang message na naririnig natin, they are calling on yung mga emerging countries to take on greater responsibility in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of phasing out coal. Yan. So,
Mhm.
very, very particular sila sa kung ano din yung tina-target nila na na fossil fuel source, because coal actually is already on the decline. Coal use is already on the decline sa developed world, no, sa mga
Well.
developed countries. But what they are using is actually oil and natural gas. But in the developing countries, coal is still in use. Coal is still the primary source of energy, but we need to transition. But that transition has to be supported with robust, new and additional climate finance, which they are not delivering.
Mhm.
Which leads me to the point about, their commitment uh, on the issue of climate finance.
Mhm.
They have failed, no? They have failed to come up to their promise that they made way back in 2009 at COP15 to mobilize 100 US dollars, 100 billion US dollars per year of climate finance by 2020. The most recent
Mhm.
report made by the OECD is that the shortfall in terms of meeting that USD 100 billion USD climate finance pledge is about 17 billion US dollars. So yun yung
Wow.
kulang na hindi nila na made, no? Hindi nila na
Mhm.
i-deliver. So yun, so with their failure to commit to their climate finance promise, we are experiencing more weather extremes because, no, we are already reaching yung limits noong adaptation to climate change. We are also reaching the limits to mitigation, and what we are experiencing now is increasing losses and damages due to climate change. So that was
Mhm.
also a conversation that took center stage in 2021 doon sa Glasgow nung COP26. Um, so there's this demand, no, from developing countries for new and additional finance for losses and
Loss
damages
and
due to climate
damage.
change. Yes, L&D finance.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, developed countries also are not willing to commit to new and additional climate finance for loss and damage. But what they were ready to commit at that time was to have a dialogue. So there was this Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage. So it's a
Yeah.
dialogue, conversation on how to address loss and damage, but no clear commitment about mobilizing, actually providing new and
Providing.
additional finance, no, for loss and damage. So that's
Right.
going to be another fight that we expect to happen at COP27 when we go to
Right.
Egypt.
I will go to loss and damage later siguro, sir. But for civil society or organizations like Ibon International, ano po ba yung ano yung priorities and demands ninyo at ng most of the civil society world at this year's talks here sa COP27? Ano yung pinaka gusto nating i-focus o i-drum up yung message ngayong kasi again, it's COP27 meaning, 'di ba? Ilang years na tayong nag-uusap about the climate. So what are our key messages this year?
Okay, I think number one para sa amin, yung keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal alive. And to keep that temperature goal, it has, and the way to keep that temperature goal is through equitable phase out of fossil fuels. Yan.
Mhm.
So, para sa amin, importante na mag-commit ang mga developed countries ng mas ambitious mitigation contributions, because we are not seeing that. Yung ambitious mitigation commitments from developed countries, especially now with the with the war in Ukraine and the
Ukraine.
current uh, economic crisis, many countries are reverting to the use of fossil fuels. Even Germany, which has been a climate leader in the last few years, I think they're looking at tapping into natural gas, no, which is a fossil fuel, to bridge no their energy gap. No?
Mhm.
So there is that need, no, for us to actually mobilize to make developed countries take on more ambitious mitigation commitments. So that's one. And then the other one is also about adaptation. So which I discussed earlier,
Mhm.
importante para sa ating mga nasa developing countries yung usapin ng adaptation, usapin ng uh, yung resilience ng ating mga communities sa harap ng increasing weather extremes, and then new and additional finance for loss and damage. So I think generally yun yung mga magiging mainit na issue na mangyayari sa COP27, at yun yung para sa amin sa civil society, yun yung aming babantayan. Babantayan namin yung dapat hindi lang yung 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal, pero yung mismong prinsipyo din ng common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities na tingin namin ay yun nga, it has been developed countries has been very intent, no, on diluting that principle sa usapin ng mitigation, sa usapin ng climate finance.
Sa loss
Okay.
and damage, Ivan, ano ba yung why is there an urgency now more than ever to push for the establishment of this loss and damage finance facility? Like kasi nga 'di ba, sabi mo nga kanina talks pa lang eh. I mean, like okay, willing na sila to dialogue, but why is there an urgency to actually put their money in this kind of commitment?
Mm. Yeah, kasi importante yung loss and damage because we are experiencing more and more weather extremes, no? At kaya naman natin nararanasan yung mga yung increasing weather extremes is because for the longest time, countries have not been doing their job, no, of
Mhm.
reducing their emissions. Papainit ng papainit yung mundo. At papaunti ng papaunti yung minomobilize na resources para yung mga communities natin ay maka-adapt, no, doon sa challenge ng global warming. So, ang usapin talaga ng loss and damage, ito yung limit ng mitigation, ito yung limit ng adaptation. At kailangan natin ng resources, no, additional resources para i-rebuild yung ating mga communities pagkatapos ng bagyo, para buhayin yung ating ekonomiya, para i-repair yung mga infrastructure na nasisira because of super typhoons, para i-rebuild yung ating agrikultura when there is droughts, extreme droughts that are happening. So we need that new and additional finance on top of what they are already mobilizing para tayo mag-adapt doon sa climate change, para tayo mag-transition into more sustainable and greener energy systems.
Mhm.
Given all these challenges and these lofty goals, no, can you tell us what the morale is like for NGOs, for CSOs, heading into COP? Are you hopeful? Are you optimistic, frustrated, or are you guarded?
We are Of course, we are intent on pushing for our demands in this very important climate policy making space. But there is also some sort of frustration because at least for the last 2 years, we have seen closing space, no, doon sa UNFCCC, the closing civic
Mhm.
space sa COP
Mhm.
meetings. Many developing countries, many organizations from the global south were not able to come to
Mhm.
Glasgow because it was really very expensive for them to go to COP.
Yeah. Yeah.
COP
Mhm.
actually is already very expensive for
Mhm.
many
Mhm.
civil society organizations to join, no, na magbiyahe papunta sa iba't ibang bansa, magbuo ng delegation. Even for some developing country parties, no, even for governments, some of them find it really challenging mobilizing a delegation to COP. And it's very important for civil society and developing country parties to be there at the table because they are the ones who are in the front lines of the climate crisis. Sila yung pinaka-apektado and they have very important agenda to push and promote sa loob ng conference of parties. So, yun, meron
Actually,
tayong
I was gonna ask about that kasi frankly, a lot of important deliberations and decisions made during COP happen inside closed doors. So parang, di ba, why do you keep going there and why is it important? Why is it important that organizations like Ibon continue to attend these events?
Yeah, importante para sa amin na mag-mobilize during conference of party meetings kasi we cannot just let big polluters and developed countries set the agenda. Actually, this coming COP27 is being sponsored by Coca-Cola, which is one of the
Which
most
is
problematic
ironic to say the least.
corporations. Yes. So yun, importante sa atin yon na hindi natin hahayaan lang na malaya sila mag-set ng agenda. Although it's going to be very challenging for civil society, importante that we put up a fight. At importante din na mag-mobilize tayo sa labas ng COP. So that's yung importante din para sa mga civil society, especially netong mga nakaraang taon. So at COP26 nabanggit ko na yun nga naging mahirap para sa maraming mga civil society from the global south yung mag-participate doon sa process. Lalo na dito sa gaganaping COP27 sa Egypt, no? Because wala actually espasyo or lugar para sa independent mobilization ng mga movements and civil society na traditionally ginagawa nila, no? Ginagawa namin during COP meetings, yung parallel People's COP Summit. Yan. Wala tayong ganun sa this year because yung political climate sa Egypt ay hindi conducive, no, para sa ganung tipo ng independent civil society mobilization and action. So there is that ongoing conversation actually within the global climate justice movement to think about how to confront that challenge of conducting independent mobilization, conducting an independent people's climate summit. Next year it's going to be in Dubai. So again, it's gonna be a challenge. What we definitely anticipate na wala na namang espasyo, no, para sa civil society na mag-conduct ng independent mobilizations around COP. So yun, may mga ganong conversation sa loob ng global climate justice movement. Paano haharapin yung ganong challenge? Paano tayo maghahanap ng sarili nating space para i-challenge yung narrative ng mga big polluters at ng mga developed countries? And then may usapin din na tignan yung iba't iba pa mga iba't ibang mga policy making spaces wherein we can also echo yung mga messages na mga policy messages and recommendations na binibitbit natin sa Conference of Parties. So we're also looking at mobilizing sa mga meetings organized by G20 or during the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund at ng World Bank because these institutions also have a very important role then in terms of setting the climate policy, the global climate policy na may kinalaman sa whether or not makukuha natin yung Paris temperature goal na i-limit yung global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
may sagot na ba ang mga civil society organization sa mga tanong na 'to? Like kayo sir, meron na ba kayong, mga plans? Anong mga gagawin niyo when you go to Egypt, next week?
Yes, so ang gagawin namin sa Egypt, we have a side event on the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. So this is an official side event sa loob ng COP. Importante sa amin yung topic na ito, yung global stocktake of the Paris Agreement, kasi ito yung review mechanism ng Paris Agreement to determine kung ginagawa ba ng mga bansa yung kanilang trabaho to limit yung 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, no? And other commitments nila in terms of climate finance, in terms of adaptation, uh, in terms of loss and damage, no? And in terms of even protecting yung ating mga environmental defenders. So it's an important process for us to participate kasi doon natin pwedeng ihayag or i yun, doon natin pwedeng ihayag sa mga policy makers yung nakikita nating mga gaps at kung ano pa yung mga pwedeng solusyon, no, nung nanggagaling sa grassroots mismo para i-address yung climate crisis. So yun, so we have that side event and then we also have an exhibit para bigyan natin para i-highlight, no, to highlight our environmental defenders which have very important role to play sa ating laban para sa climate justice, sa ating laban para laban sa global warming, but they are under attack. So as you all know, Philippines, in the recent report of frontline defenders, I think we are number 2 in terms of the most dangerous country for environmental defenders. So that speaks a lot in terms of ano ba yung ginagawa ng pamahalaan para protektahan yung ating human rights, para protektahan yung climate.
Sir, will there be activities here in the Philippines to parallel what's happening in Egypt? Kasi since you're talking about medyo mahirap taking up space, holding people's mobilizations in Egypt, parang would there be mobilizations here in the Philippines too?
Yes. So I think on November 12, it has been identified as the Global Day of Action for Climate Justice. So yung Global Climate Justice Movement, I'm speaking of different networks. You have the Climate Action Network, you have the Demand Climate Justice Network, and then even International also has its number of allies, climate justice allies. In many parts of the world, they determined November 12th as the Global Day of Action for Climate Justice. Sa Egypt, I think there's going to be a mobilization, but there are also going to be decentralized actions happening in many countries, including the Philippines. So I don't have the full details yet kung ano yung plan sa Philippines, mobilization for November 12. But definitely there's going to be some actions that are going to take place here in the Philippines in support of that November 12 Global Day of Action for Climate Justice.
Mm-hmm. Sir, pagdating naman sa ating Philippine delegation, right now, hindi pa natin masyadong alam kung who will this be composed or sino ang magli-lead. Unlike last year, actually, nalaman din natin last year, like a week or days before the start of the talks. And last year, it was led by our finance secretary. And so we don't know yet what will happen this year. Pero regardless, what should our delegation focus on while they're in Egypt? Ano ba yung dapat nating i-push for the talks from the civil society organizations? Ano yung tingin nyo dapat maging priorities ng ating delegation? And how do we connect this sa reality ng climate change na nangyayari sa atin on the ground? Like we know this weekend nga merong bagyong paparating, di ba? It's really real for us.
Yes. The Philippines should be a strong voice, no, in terms of demanding new and additional finance for loss and damage. So, I think yearly, if my figures are correct, yung losses natin when we experience climate extremes such as super typhoons, it's about 500 billion pesos, no? more than 500 billion pesos in terms of losses and damages due to weather extremes. So the Philippines should be, one of those parties in the front lines of fighting for new and additional finance for loss and damage. It should also be in the front lines of demanding more ambitious climate finance for adaptation and mitigation. Uh, when we say climate finance, it should be finance that is, global public climate finance. Because yung sa recent na engagement namin, at least doon sa mga nag-participate doon sa Glasgow last year, ang priority nila ay not really about demanding public climate finance contributions from developed countries, but more on mobilizing the private sector, private climate finance coming from the private sector, which we think is problematic because the interest of the private sector does not usually align with interest of communities. Katulad ng binanggit ko kanina, yung the larger chunk of climate finance is going towards mitigation projects. But mitigation projects are not necessarily the priority of developing countries like the Philippines. We need adaptation. We need finance for adaptation projects, building community resilience, no? Enhancing yung ating mga disaster emergency preparedness systems, which are not necessarily lucrative, in terms of generating profits, but are very much needed by communities that are, experiencing climate disasters. So yun yung tingin namin dapat mensahe na bibitbitin ng Pilipinas, ng Philippine delegation. Huwag mag-give in doon sa narrative na hayaan na lang yung big business ang mag-mobilize ng finance para sa climate action, para sa mga developing countries like the Philippines. It should be public finance, no? Because that public finance, it's more predictable, more sustainable, and mas mayroong accountability because those are funds coming from governments. Meron kang i-hold to account, unlike business, no, na hindi naman pumirma sa mga conventions, climate accords like the UNFCCC.
For yung dynamics sir ng civil society organizations, ng Philippine organizations with the delegation, meron ba kayong mga gustong, like, sana ba mas maging open sila to your suggestions? May mga ganun ba kayong, kumbaga, wish list nyo for this year's talks?
Yan, actually, hindi pa namin talaga na-experience makipag-interact sa Philippine delegation. So, I'm not sure if it's because international NGO kami, so they don't feel na kami dapat yung ka-interact nila. Sa pagkakaalam ko sa mga friends natin dito sa Pilipinas, yung sa mga movements, environmental and climate justice movements dito sa Pilipinas, wala pa atang nag-approach sa kanila from the Philippine delegation to have some coordination, to have some cooperation on the important messages na bibitbitin for COP27. I don't know kung very open din makipag-collaborate yung ating Philippine delegation sa mga CSOs. So that is, a continuing challenge. Unlike before, no, na medyo mas may open relationship yung ating Philippine climate delegation sa civil society. Some civil society leaders are even being tapped as consultants ng Philippine delegation to provide technical knowledge, to provide expert insights doon sa nangyayari sa negotiations. But parang wala atang ganung...
That was during the Aquino administration. Tama
right,
mo ba?
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So because we are now under a new administration, syempre tapos na yung Duterte administration, we really don't know kung ano yung magiging relationship. So I guess kami rin oobserbahan din po namin kung ano yung mga mangyayari, di ba, sa climate talks this year. Ivan, every year, the language of the climate talks, actually, kahit kaming mga journalists, mayroon pa ring challenge in catching up with the language, di ba, of the climate, Pero clearly, there is an urgency for more people to understand what's happening in this annual global event and know how it could impact them. In simplest terms, for you, how would you explain what's at stake in this year's talks in a language that every Filipino will understand?
Paano kaya? Eh di siguro papaliwanag natin by tapping into the realities, no, of communities. Nakaka-experience tayo ng bagyo, nasisira yung mga pananim, binabaha tayo, nasisira yung ating mga infrastructure. On top of that, meron tayong kinakaharap pa na iba pa mga development problems like poverty, joblessness, unemployment, maliit na sweldo. So these development problems are being amplified, no? Pinapalala ng krisis sa klima. So importante na bantayan natin yung mangyayaring usapin, negosasyon sa Conference of Parties, kung paano i-address, re-resolbahin ng mga gobyerno yung problema ng climate change kasi may impact ito sa ating buhay, sa ating mga komunidad, sa ating mga kakainin, ganyan sa ating kinikita. So, yan, importante talaga na makialam tayo at mag-mobilize at mag-take part sa mga pagkilos para makamit natin yung climate justice na tinatawag natin. Kasi yung climate justice, usapin siya na meron tayong problema ng climate change na hindi natin nilikha, pero tayo yung numero unong nakakaranas ng impacts niya, no? And unfair siya kasi hindi naman tayo yung culprit. Bukod pa doon, wala din tayong resources para kaharapin yung problema ng krisis sa klima. Yun. Siguro ganon. Hindi ko alam kung nakakaantig na ba siya para sa mga ordinaryong tao para makialam at makisangkot. Yun.
Given na climate change is a global crisis and sa every year na merong Conference of Parties, nakikita nga natin na it takes the whole world, a lot of nations to talk about, to tackle climate action. But you also spoke about the issues hounding us, kung paano tayo nagkakaroon ng climate injustice. You talked about development issues, joblessness, etc. So siguro, parang hindi naman sobrang medyo helpless na parang pupunta kayo doon and closed doors yung mga importanteng mga usapin. Siguro going back here in the Philippines, what are organizations like IBON, what are environmental advocates hoping that the Philippine government, yung priorities, yung next immediate steps ng Philippine government to tackle climate justice in our own backyard?
In our own backyard. Siguro, numero uno para sa atin, yung respeto para sa civic space. Yung respeto para sa mga organizations na mag-organisa, respeto para sa mga environmental defenders for them to be able to do their work. Because yun nga, diba, ito yung challenge, at least nung sa nakaraang administration, we have seen a number of environmental and land defenders under attack and even killed. So dapat may ina-expect sana natin na may commitment yung gobyerno natin na irespeto yung trabaho na ginagawa ng ating mga human rights activists, ng ating mga land rights defenders, land rights advocates, ng ating mga climate justice activists, at ng ating mga environmental defenders. So tingin ko, yun. So dapat may commitment from the government sa ganung usapin at support din doon sa mga civil society organizations that are trying to come up with solutions, trying to come up with their own action para i-enhance yung kapasidad ng mga communities na i-weather or harapin yung challenge ng climate change. These are communities that are pursuing agroecological farming, yung mga communities natin na nagka-come up ng kani-kanila mga sariling systems para i-alert yung mga community when there are climate disasters, when there are super typhoons, etc. Yun, so support in terms of giving them that space, and then of course giving them the financial and technical support then, no, para for them to be able to do their work.
Okay. Ivan, salamat sa pagsama sa amin today. Aabangan namin kung ano yung gagawin nyo sa Egypt in the coming weeks. Kung gusto nilang sundan yung mga gagawin nyo, saan ka nila pwedeng abangan? Meron bang social media accounts na pwede mong i-promote right now?
Yes, so may Facebook page, si Iwan International. And then we are also on Twitter. I think ang handle namin sa Twitter ay at Ibon INTERNATL. So yun. Yes, Ibon International. Yeah.
Okay, and good luck sa ating lahat in the coming weeks
Good
for the
luck.
COP27 coverage for us, and then for you also for the talks. And follow Rappler's coverage of the upcoming 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference by going to our website, rappler.com, or following our social media accounts on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Wow, may TikTok. Magti-TikTok ba kayo doon, sir?
Actually, inisip nga din namin to come up with with new ways to communicate to the public kung ano nangyayari. So
I think you
we're
should
thinking of
consider
coming up
TikTok.
with
TikTok is the way.
yung mga popular video shorts, ganyan, para lang ma-inform yung mga tao kung ano na yung nangyayari sa climate talks.
Right.
Yes.
Especially yung mga young people din. And if you have questions and suggestions for future episodes, you can reach Iya at Iya Gozomo. Ako na nag-promote for you.
Wow.
Iya, on Twitter. Yung Instagram niya ay private, so hindi ko ipopromote.
For private,
For
content.
private lang. And message me on Twitter and Instagram at G Geronimo. Bye!